Hello, good afternoon, everyone. We're so pleased to be here to talk about connected television on this lovely windy day. Watch out for our hair and our dresses as they go flying. I have an illustrious panel here with me to talk about connected television, and of course we believe that it is here to stay. I'll let them introduce themselves, and then I'll give a little bit of background, and then we'll get into the discussion. My name is Jennifer Churchill. I am the VP of Enterprise Sales at Kargo. So, Minai, go ahead.
Hi everyone, I'm Minai Bowie. I'm Director of Product Marketing at Samsung Ads for Europe.
Hi, my name is Amnon Siev. I'm the CEO of GeoEdge, an ad quality vendor, helping publisher and platform to check the quality of ad that's running on their inventory.
And I am Sedge. I am the CEO of Scene Connect, which is a celebrity and influencer marketing agency. It's a slightly different view and opinion from these guys.
Yes, a very interesting one. Well, good. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for being here. I thought I would just run through some interesting stats about connected television before we get started. These are stats that I've accumulated either from eMarketer, IAB, or the Trade Desk. But we have the U.S. represented here, as well as Europe, as well as Israel. So we have the U.K. We have a real international panel here. But in terms of the U.S., some of the stats that I wanted to share with you is that 96% of U.S. households have access to connected television. So it is ubiquitous. The ad spend on connected television in the U.S. is projected to increase another 21% this year to $22.5 billion. That's the U.S. market alone. That's from the IAB. Linear usage is going to decline again this year by 5%. 1 in 2 millennials have no access to traditional television at all. So half of the users out there can't even access linear. And then these were some interesting stats I thought from the Trade Desk. They've done a lot of work, obviously, in connected television, and they found that personalized or targeted CTV ads resulted in a 68% lift in brand favorability, 100% lift in brand recall. It's quite a large number. A 58% lift in purchase intent. So I think that the early results show that advertising and connected television could be a very influential and profitable business. So that's a little bit about what's going on in the CTV market. I wanted to start off by talking about the landscape. And I'm going to ask each panelist to really talk about their insights. What do they think is happening in the industry, in the landscape, more from a macro perspective before we get into some of the more specific topics here? So how has the shift to streaming services and CTV impacted the traditional TV landscape? Has programmatic advertising been impacted? And what are some of the key obstacles that different players may be facing related to connected television advertising? So that's a lot. But I know each of you have had a little bit of a chance to think about it. So, Minai, why don't I start with you? In terms of macro, what do you see at Samsung Ads in terms of what's going on with connected TV?
So I think at the macro level, what's really exciting for us, and you touched on it with the stats you mentioned earlier, but as a consumer ourselves, I think we all know we've never had more access to content, we've never had more control, more flexibility of what we want to watch. And then accessing that has always been so much easier now with advancements in TV technology. So I think what we see on the Samsung side very much matches what you were saying from the stats. In Europe, we're seeing over half of total viewing time being spent in streaming environments. Oh. And that's that's quite a lot. And if you think about it from a consumer standpoint, that convergence between traditional linear and streaming is already happening for them, and it's very much part of their daily viewing habits. So I think when we think about that and the implications, what's interesting for us is we're seeing a lot of brands and agencies have to rethink the way that they historically have planned traditional linear TV. So we've seen a lot of agencies and brands create advanced TV teams or total TV teams, so that they can start to plan by measure across those two more holistically. And then I guess macro, it brings us to the challenge, which is that there's no consistency in measurement. So there's an ambition to start to look at these two channels more holistically, but there's barriers because we just have no way of measuring that in a consistent manner.
That is so interesting. Measurement is one of the topics we're going to get to, so thank you so much. Super interesting. Amnon, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing from the macro perspective in terms of your company and your perspective?
Sure. So we are in a bit unique place because we have the opportunity to work with different players in the value chain. And essentially, I think we are actually in the middle of a transition between something I call like semi-programmatic to full programmatic.
Semi-programmatic
to full programmatic. So
yeah, talk about that.
If we're like looking on the ecosystem, like 2, 3, 4 years ago, there were like different bottlenecks in supply and demand. Okay, in some cases there was a lot of demand, there wasn't enough supply, and vice versa. We are not there yet, so I mean it's clear that there was a lot of demand, and also I think we are in a rapid supply that is being generated on every day. On the other hand, there are many. If I compare it, to traditional programmatic, there are many players now that are trying basically to establish a piece of the pie in the programmatic revenue. Okay, so there are the device manufacturer on one hand, there are new players like the Roku's of the world that come in with a pure. There are the traditional SSPs, and there are the ad servers that also now have a piece of technology, and it's not clear yet with the actual and it will be the one that will actually dominate the monetization portion of that. In addition, with that in mind, we are talking about measurement, we are talking about fraud, you're talking about brain safety, things that we solve. So even the signals that are, moving from one end, from the supply to the demand, are really fragmented. The standards are not all there. That creates many, many challenges that prevent from fully programmatic to actually materialize.
Interesting. I would love to delve into that a little bit deeper after we hear from Sedge, but I think that's super interesting.
Yeah, I would just add to what Minai was saying, which is, but from a brand's marketeer's perspective, with the choice and the ease of access to be able to stream anywhere on any device. Like I was thinking this weekend, my husband was watching the golf whilst he was pretending to entertain me and watch Nashville, whilst also strolling TikTok. And from a brand's perspective, it's not the same as linear, where you knew when they were watching at the specific time, the cliffhanger would come, and then you'd get your ad space. So you really got to try so much harder to engage and entertain your audience, whichever device it is that they are tuning into and seeing the kind of different ad space that you guys will throw out.
Oh, that's very interesting. I'd love to talk more about that too, just kind of from the creative perspective, like, are we moving away from traditional 15s and 30s, and what are we moving to, and to that as well. Also, just for the audience, what we're going to be talking about today, some of the trends that we're seeing, brand and user safety, ad effectiveness measurement, staying ahead of the curve is the key takeaways, but we will have time, I think, at the end for questions. So if you have any questions, please hold on to them, and hopefully we'll get to you. Okay, so in terms of trends, what are you seeing in terms of the latest trends? We sort of talked about overall landscape and kind of the big picture, but what are the sort of more recent trends and how players effectively leverage some of these trends? I think that it could be an interesting opportunity to talk about some of the content that's being developed out there. Minai, why don't we start with you on that?
Yeah, I think the trends specific to advertising that we're seeing that's really interesting is just this real rapid growth of ad-funded streaming services. So I think we all know, like obviously Netflix, Disney, they've created their own ad-funded models. And then we've got this rise of, without using acronyms, like FAST platforms, so free ad-supported streaming TV. And Samsung has one, Samsung TV Plus. We're seeing a rise of that as well. And I mention this as an interesting insight because there's two reasons. One is we're seeing viewership grow there. So in the UK, where on Samsung TVs, we've seen viewership in ad-funded streaming services grow by 150%.
Oh, really?
Since Jan
Can you
2020.
talk about what some of that content is? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of anything that's streaming that has ad-supported content on it. So it could be BVOD, it could be like a broadcaster video on demand, it could be fast.
But are the channels by genre, or is it sort of a mix and match? Or
So when it's by, for instance, with fast, that's quite unique because that is curated based on genre.
okay,
And I think when we talk about these things, there's a lot of similarities to TV and then there's some nuances. Similarities, it's broadcaster quality content, it's curated, it's streamed, not streamed, it's scheduled, and then it's watched often on the biggest screen of the home. So they're the commonalities. I think what makes Fast a bit different is you have the opportunity to create channels that cater to a specific niche audience. I think that becomes quite interesting because as a brand, you can then start to have these additional contextual signals that you can use when you're advertising. And I think for CTV, the deprecation of cookies don't impact us as much because we work in a cookieless environment. But when that does happen and a client or brand is looking to have consistency in how they're targeting users, context is something that can have that commonality. So I think that there's some interesting use cases that can be pulled out. But what I find interesting is both the trend of there's a lot of users watching it now. Obviously, economic reasons, they're more receptive to ads on it now. They're used to getting that value exchange. But then at the same time, you've got these services that's creating really good content. So those two things I think are quite interesting for what we're doing in ads.
Oh no, I see that. I do think I feel like I've been in this business a while, and it was very much sort of contextual targeting before cookies. Then we swung very heavily to cookie-based and audience targeting, and I think we may be seeing the pendulum swinging a little bit back the other way. And of course, CTV is a great example of that. But Sedge, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the overlap, maybe cross-screen behavior, and any sort of latest trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, so again, just to add, I think from a more broad marketeer's perspective, you have the opportunity now to just kind of almost rip up the rule book and start again, because it used to be very broadcast. How many eyeballs can I get on this content? And actually now, as measurement, and we'll obviously get there, has evolved and developed, actually it's much more about targeted audiences. And more broadly in social and influencer, you don't want the celebrity with the biggest name anymore. You want to start breaking down that audience demographic and really understanding the who and going into those subcultures, those fandoms. And that's obviously from a Samsung's perspective. If you're into cooking, you can view that content of Jamie Oliver. I think in the UK, it's an ITVX is probably the best example with Love Island. I just came back from our US office.
Well, tell us about Love Island, since I live in the US.
This is all any American wants to talk about. I was in New York for a month and I was meeting every age profile, interest profile possible, but because you can access it, to exactly your point, how we kicked this off, you can access this content for free anywhere, on any device. And there's people getting the subway into work watching Love Island. There's people at home making it a family affair, or living in flat shares wanting to just talk about who's kissing who. And it's we've got a lot to thank the pandemic for that escapism of that content. And again, it comes back to what I was saying earlier around entertaining and engaging your audiences, but it has to live further than just CTV. And so an example of some of the work that we've done with eBay is eBay wanted to be the headline sponsor of Love Island. And the reason for that is they are all about pre-loved, all about sustainability, and no one thinks in that lens when they think about eBay. They think, am I going to get a deal? Is this actually going to be legit? And so eBay became the headline sponsor for Love Island, and everyone on the show is obviously wearing pre-loved items, but you don't know that because they're not getting ready saying, and this Prada dress that I got, there's one item on eBay, you can't actually get it because I'm wearing it right now. And so it had to be much more about the conversation offline. And so what we then did with eBay is take the profiles of those contestants who were pre-show when they had 1,000 followers and were single. And they were all they were talking about was sustainability and their views within that space. So it wasn't a badging exercise. It wasn't a pay to play from an eBay perspective, but the adverts were living on ITV. And then you followed those contestants because you really believed in them, their message, their narrative. And we've done it for the second season now with Tash and Tom. I'd love to tell you more about them, but I actually haven't watched the last 2 seasons, which probably goes against everything.
So wait, how many followers do they have now? Because you said they started with 1,000 before the show.
Yeah, so like you've got Tash, who's got just shy of 700,000.
Wow.
I actually don't know what Tom's got, but you've got people like Molly May. Obviously, she's partnered with Pretty Little Thing, so very, very different brand partnerships, but based on that persona, and it ties back into, again, understanding the audience, understanding the niche and what that narrative is, and how you can then get that message out outside of just TVC.
Right.
And I've been on so many shoots in my career where they've sent the social media intern and they've just said, oh, get a TikTok, get a reel, get a few behind the scenes shots, and you've got this amazing campaign with Michelle Keegan or with Peter Crouch, and it's not being distributed across the rest of the platforms and touch points.
Oh, wow. Okay, super interesting. Hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that. But Amnon, tell me about any trends that you're seeing in terms of the space that you play in, any recent innovations. I know you talked a little bit about sort of privacy and fraud, and any new developments there that we should be aware of.
Yeah, I will talk about my space, but just one I want to add
go
like
for
a very interesting aspect. So we are moving into an era that the entire targeting and segmentation, all this is changing, right? It will be different metrics, right? How do you segment? Do you segment by the show? Do you segment according to pattern, other show that they saw? Do you segment according to the household? I mean, that's opening interesting opportunities. On the other hand, we are now in the era of rapid machine learning, okay? So think about the opportunity to use, there is a show, you can actually create in real time using some deep fake technology, using a celebrity, a tailored message to a certain segment. These components are already there, right? So these are not, what I'm saying, right, it's not like the future, this is already here. So the moment you will be able to actually provide indication about the signal, there are really interesting opportunities for advertising to come up with really crazy and creative idea, and in low cost. So the production costs are low, because which was always a big barrier. Now you can just create million variation of the same ad with different text in almost
Computers.
Yeah,
With
exactly.
AI, yeah.
Zero cost. And also there is a big question how users will be able to interact with the banner, okay, which is a bit related, to our world.
That's
So
come
people
up
were, so there's the QR mode, which I'm not a big believer, because essentially you create here. I don't think it's a user-friendly interaction. You want pull your phone, wait until you're in the right time, but it's not exactly. It will not exactly work, and I think a company like Samsung and LG are taking that into consideration, and the next generation of ad will allow you some kind of interaction that will move
You mean not through a QR code, just directly through your
through
your phone, or through your remote, or
through your remote, ideally, because I think, to your point, it's really, I mean, unless you're already second screening and you're watching, but the chances, like, it has to be really captivating for you to go, okay, I'm going to take a snap of that QR code. I think what was it, the Super Bowl last year or the year before, like that crashed it for Coinbase, and I think it had this resurgence and everyone was talking about it, but actually when you really think about it, most QR code campaigns are really effective because that value exchange isn't there.
Right.
So to get someone to take a photo of it, so I agree, I think interactivity is important, and you need to find a way to start making the CTV format less brand and like connecting it back to performance. But how we do that, I think we're still testing that.
Yeah, you're familiar with in Netflix, there are all the interactive shows for kids that they can actually change the plot in real time. Okay, do you want that the superhero will jump, or I don't know, have dinner, and then that's the best example I could come with. But so I think that could also be an interesting way to interact with an app. So all these opportunities are there, and I think we are, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg.
It came up on a panel that I was at this morning with Best Buy, that they were running a video ad on the one half of the screen, and then a shoppability capability on the other half, and that whole shoppability with CTV is really going to be important in the future. But do you want to talk a little bit about brand and user safety? Because I do think that this is a little bit the Wild West. People say that connected television is kind of the Wild West. You know, I was in mobile 10 years ago. We used to call mobile the Wild West. So what are some of the issues that you're seeing? What are examples of brand safety violations that we should be aware of? Any recommendations for how to get ahead of the issue before it becomes a really big problem, or maybe it already is? You can tell us.
So I will start with a question, okay? So the family now watch, PG-13 content on a Samsung TV with a Roku stick, okay, using a third-party application, and they're streaming CBS content, okay? Now
PG-13, you said, yeah?
Yeah, let's say.
Okay.
I mean, and now there is an ad with alcohol.
Alcohol ad, okay.
Who should I call? Okay, and that's, I think, the essence of the problem. Okay,
Yeah.
there are now so many people are trying to put their hands into the programmatic. Okay, and when we are talking about so the moment you are moving to the full programmatic and you really have an open marketplace, okay, then you're talking about efficiency. You're talking about the fact that any buyer can basically come up to a self-serve DSP, upload the creative, and hopefully be able to buy inventory. That's the promise. That's where you will see the magic happen. But then you need to have in place all the brand safety measurement, both to protect the brand as well as to protect the user. So our job, our mission is to protect the user, which I keep preaching that are the most important one. I know that you guys follow the money, which are the brand, which I get.
Well, that too.
But we are passionate about making sure that the user are protected. CTV, big screen, you don't really know who is the user, okay? There is a good chance there is a young audience, okay? And that's going to be a huge problem, okay?
So do you have any tools, or how are you helping brands to think about this?
Right. So what is happening right now, so the transition is that companies do deal with that. So the problem is there, but they're using like manual tool, okay? And when you use manual tool, I mean, putting aside the cost and efficiency, that cannot be programmatic by definition. Because that means that you need to put the creative in some kind of a quarantine, and only then after it was approved, and all the fancy things that we just talked about, the dynamic way, you lose all the magic of programmatic. And when you start to see real programmatic, and really an open RTB with a real auction, with a real opportunity, okay, you need to have in place tools that will automatically vet the creative and vet the target.
Let me throw this to you at Samsung ads. I mean, do you see this like alcohol, for example? There's an alcohol, or do you accept alcohol advertising? And if so, how do you gate that for the correct age and audience?
So I think for us, we follow similar rules that TV broadcasters follow. So we have policies that govern what advertisers we accept and when. I think what you brought up, Amnon, is super, super interesting, and I think it really ties in from like protecting the publisher. So as Samsung TV Plus, like we care about our platform and our users, and we want to protect that. I do also want to flag, I think sometimes we conflate it as well. And I think from the advertiser brand safety, I think it's less, there's more provisions in place now where it's less prominent. So if we think about, there's this, I think basically the industry is a little bit hung up from what happened with display and online video back in the day, where brand safety was a huge issue and something that was a major concern. And one of the reasons is there's so many players. With CTV, at least in Europe for now, there's less players, one, and then two, the cost and investment to enter the market can be quite prohibitive. So we don't expect, I don't expect there to be as many CTV players as there are, display publishers, online video publishers. So there's one. The other thing too is what we're finding, and right or wrong, but a lot of agencies and brands are protecting themselves by having direct deals. So most CTV inventory in Europe is still transacted directly.
Not programmatically.
Programmatically, but using like programmatic direct or programmatic guarantee.
Okay.
And so they're able to work directly with the end publisher or broadcaster. They're able to have assurance with them where they're actually, what inventory they're buying. So I think there's that. Plus, to your point, there's like a lot of advancements right now in technology around measurement and verification that I think give advertisers and brands a little bit more confidence when they're buying in the CTV space, that they can kind of use these tools to protect themselves. But I agree, it's not true programmatic yet, because it's not like it's all in the open web.
Right.
And I think that there's those reservations that prevent it from being there. But I do think that, the two lenses, it's really interesting because one is like a publisher trying to protect a brand. I think we do have a lot of tools, technologies in place to do that. And then, as a platform trying to protect the user, it's hard because you don't know who's sitting behind that screen.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, why don't we talk a little bit about one of my favorite topics of ad effectiveness and sort of touching on what you were talking about, Sedge, just creative in general and the opportunity with connected television, because it's so much more than linear, of course, and allows for just more creativity in terms of using the screen, in terms of ad lengths, whatever maybe makes sense. And I was just curious, do you think that CTV maybe can captivate attention differently from traditional TV? And I know that Samsung has some research in this area as well, but just curious if you have any thoughts on the creative side of the connected TV.
Yeah, I would say it has to, because
to.
we've already talked about how the behaviors around linear TV you said it's a 5% decline coming again this year. You have to change the behavior to adapt to the audience that are viewing and watching, and also not knowing who's even watching. And the best parallel I can pull is what happened with TikTok in the pandemic, and how it did become not a social platform but a platform to entertain. And the developments that they've had as a platform, thinking about TikTok Shop, thinking about the seamless user journey to make sure that you see and can purchase directly. And I think that's probably the most interesting space for me around marrying up the creative with the CTV, and then looking at the performance that then has from a brand's perspective. From your CMO is always going to spend more money if it drives revenue for the bottom line.
Yeah, and talk to us, Minai, a little bit about, I know you guys did some research. I don't know if you can share any of the highlights of your findings, but in terms of ad effectiveness, connected television versus other platforms.
Yeah. So we commissioned a study with Siev, which looked at ad effectiveness and looking at how consumers view advertising on connected television versus, say, linear. So we looked at ad-funded platforms, broadcaster, video on demand, linear. And what was interesting for us is, so a couple of stats, 69% of the consumers in the UK said that they would be willing to watch ads in return for free content. 62.
Oh, interesting. Very.
And I think that they're more receptive to that now. They understand that value exchange more than before. 62% said that they would be willing to watch ads if they felt it was relevant. And then for me, what was really interesting was when you kind of look at the contrast between advertising on streaming environments versus advertising in linear, it's quite comparable. So 48% said they would watch an ad, sit down and watch the ad in full if they're watching it on a streaming platform. And then on linear, it was 43%. So it's pretty comparable. And the reason
Higher on streaming.
it's higher on streaming. It is higher on streaming, but it's pretty similar.
Yep.
And what I think is so interesting is with CTV, we don't have all of the research yet around ad effectiveness. But with linear, we have decades of research that's proven effectiveness of being able to reach people on that big screen. So I think now knowing kind of consumers actually think of the two platforms quite similar, they just view it all as TV. I think we can start to take some learnings from the studies that linear has done, find some correlations as we build out our own studies within CTV, but really start to think about, as you said, Sedge, I think the beauty of connected television is we have access to more data than we've ever had before. And we've got controls to be able to understand, what's the optimal ad break length? What's the optimal ad length? So, using that data, testing and learning, and then trying to create an ad experience that consumers are really receptive to. I feel like we've got that within our toolkit to be able to start looking at.
What for example, are your clients running on Samsung ads? Do you take any length ads, or does it have to be less than a certain amount or more than a certain amount? Or
No, we take all lengths. So
All lengths?
honestly, I think the most we see is 15s and 30 seconds.
those would be the longest, yeah.
Yeah, and they're the ones we are most common.
Most common.
I do think it's
Okay.
naturally because, not to say that's more effective or not, but more that they're the ones that are most common. And I think it's because they're taking a TVC from a linear campaign,
And are comfortable.
yeah,
what
and
they are.
extending it. And I think partly that's because our message is that they're very similar, the consumer experience is similar, but I think we do have an opportunity to start creating more bespoke creatives, ad lengths, and then using data to be more, add precision to the targeting, to create more of a story for that user.
Can users skip the ad? Is there like a format with skippability?
We don't have skippable ads on our platform.
Not skippable.
Non-skippable.
Not skippable. Well, that's super interesting. That leads us right into measurement, because I do think a lot of this does go back to measurement. What are the unique advantages to CTV in terms of measurement? Like you talk about all the data, like what kind of data could you get? I know. For a CTV campaign, for example. Let's start with you, Amnon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in measurement. That's not our expertise. I do know that from advertiser perspective, because the inventory is fragmented, okay, so it's a bit difficult. Even if you have a good measurement, so one channel, if you want to have like a multi-channel, buying, for example, there is no way that you can know that the same ad will display to the user. So frequency capping, for example, it's a problem that was not solved yet because there's not identity for the user, and each supply and back channel have their own. I think, but again, it's not. I would say that it's going back to traditional linear TV. I mean, if you cannot have interaction with the banner, on one hand you have the impression data, on the other hand they're like offline, survey that brands are doing in order to measure the effectiveness.
So a lot of offline.
Yeah.
You see.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit about measurement? Do you have your proprietary tools, or are there third-party tools, or what do you guys use?
So we have our own proprietary tools. So because we're the TV manufacturer, we have our own ACR technology, so automatic content recognition technology, and that allows us to kind of capture what's happening on the screen and understand what people are watching, where they're watching it, how long for. So start to build out an idea of how much people are watching in traditional linear environments versus streaming environments. So that's something that we have. And then I think broadly speaking in the industry, there's almost like two paths at the moment, where there's the traditional linear TV measurement and the evolution of that.
Like the Nielsen's, etc. Yeah.
So, in Europe we've got Barb, or we've got AGF and GfK, and these measurement companies are historically panel-based. But they're investing a lot in enhancing those solutions with additional data sets. Or we've got, new initiatives like Project Origin and C-Flight in the UK, which is really focused on cross-platform measurement. And then, as I said, there's the ACR that's coming in as a different alternative. And then on the digital side, we're seeing digital-first or digital-led vendors really focused on solving specific challenges for CTV, and they're almost offering an alternative. So they're saying actually there might be another way to measure impact beyond reach and frequency, as you said, and looking at things like attention metrics. So I think it's a really interesting landscape to be a part of right now, because there's so many changes and innovations that are happening. But I will say, and I think you kind of touched on it, is the one thing we keep hearing from all clients though is like, all of this is great, but it's all siloed. And so I have to somehow piece all of this together myself. And so that's a big challenge that I think as an industry we have to solve for. How do we have that consistency? How do we have standardization? How do we have a base level that we can compare? Because it's really hard to figure out how to allocate budgets if there's no common currency to do that.
Yes, that is definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
Before we go on, any other thoughts on measurement? Okay, so we're just about to wrap up here in case anybody has any questions. In terms of staying ahead of the curve, how can different players, marketers, platforms, and publishers stay ahead of the curve in the evolving CTV landscape? What do they need to have their eye on, considering these changing consumer behaviors? Sedge, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, more of a generic one. I would just say follow the kind of thought leaders in the space on LinkedIn, because LinkedIn, we were actually talking about personal branding beforehand, but if you are an expert in this field, you don't need to wait for the drum to pick up or give you a quote anymore. You've got that profile, you can talk about it. And that's within any industry that is relevant for our clients, that's the first thing that I'll always do, is make sure I follow those key profiles.
Is there any particular person or company that you follow, or anyone you would recommend? Or you don't, if you don't want to, that's fine. Right here, Samsung ads. Okay, everybody, there you go.
Yeah, I'll come back to you on that.
Okay.
Let me think
No
about that one
worries,
through.
no worries,
Wasn't
just
expecting
curious.
that question.
No
But yeah,
worries.
but that's it, right? It's looking at who those leaders are within the space, who've got the jobs with the right brands that can produce and create that content. Actually, you're more restricted than an agency or than a brand, because you will have your internal legal teams that say what you can and can't share. Whereas I often think there's always, when I was starting my career in social, and there's now not pure play social agencies, but it was the founders of those agencies that were saying, this is what I've just done, this is how I've just hacked this, whether that then was a Stephen Bartlett or a Gary Vee. And again, personal branding is someone like an Amelia Sordell. Like, they're the people that are leading their very tailored, specific industries. Whereas when I worked at ASOS, I wasn't allowed to say anything. So it's more those that are, I hate the word trailblazing, but that's just what's come to my mind.
That's the right word.
They're challenging the space.
Yes.
They're also talking openly about the problems, whether that's measurement, whether that is working in silo. And yeah, I would always go to LinkedIn first and foremost.
I love that. Yeah, great tool. Anything from you, Amnon, in terms of the staying ahead of the curve and considering the changing consumer behaviors?
Yeah, I would say, like any trend that we saw, in ad tech, it's all about, if you're looking at it from from the vendor perspective, it's all about trust. Okay?
Trust. Yes.
Okay, trust was the pitfall of our industry, and if you actually look who are the big winners now, and you look on the companies that actually dominate the market, these were the ones that brought trust to the equation. It wasn't about the best technology, it wasn't about the best performance, it wasn't about it was about creating trust. And I think, and there was a lot of temptation right now, to make the shortcuts. Okay, and then it suddenly hit and it become too late. And when you lose trust, it's very hard to gain it back. It's trust with the consumers, it's trust with the brand, it's trust with the different authorities and regulation. GDPR came because there was an issue. So from my perspective, whatever you can be a DSP, you can be a device manufacturer, you can whatever your value proposition is, try to think how you bringing the trust into the equation and taking the measurement, even if the pain is not, clear at point one, because it will be there. There's too much money on the table, so people will find way, to abuse it and break this trust.
I like that. That's super important. I agree. Trust. Anything for you, Minai? And then we'll just get to key takeaways, and then any audience questions, and we can have a wrap.
I think one of the things I really love, Sedge, you said right at the beginning, was around just ripping up the playbook. And for me, I really think to get ahead of the curve, just use the data that we have, understand the consumer behaviors, and then try to build solutions that help that consumer. So specific to advertising, like how do we enhance that advertising experience and be able to continue to reach them in a really effective way? I think what we want to avoid as an industry is, just relying on legacy process or legacy approaches and letting that define and dictate how we do things now and in the future. So I guess for me, if we want to continually stay ahead of the curve, let's look at what the consumers are doing, because if we want to put advertising in front of them, we then have to really think about the best way to do that.
Excellent. That's it. So tear up the playbook and start over.
Yeah.
And then just it's something delicate. Lastly, any key takeaway that we maybe haven't touched on that you would share with the audience in terms of preparing for the new world, connected television?
I think we've kind of all said the same thing in different ways, but the main thing for me, and this isn't necessarily about connected television, it's more about marketing in general, is just because this feels like a new shiny thing, don't treat it in silo. Make sure that it is integrated and you're thinking about all of those touch points, and you don't have different people in different teams sweating assets differently, because the end consumer doesn't know how many people work internally, and they don't care for that individual personal opinion or how that team best thinks that they need to produce and create. So it's making sure, irrespective of where they see you, and you have to see a piece of content 11.4 times from a brand before you convert, that consistency.
can. Love that. Amnon, anything you'd leave with the audience? You already
I'm
said
good,
it.
yeah.
You're good. Minai?
The last thing is just we've all touched on it, but like TV is just TV. Like let's think
Yeah.
about it as like one. Let's try and work towards together collectively as an industry so that we can start treating it as one.
Love that. Okay, even though it's new, it's still TV. It is still that TV. So yes, you're right. Happy to start with panelists. I know it's a little windy out here. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question. You talked about a lot of brands and agencies going direct to publisher, and maybe that being kind of an old-fashioned mindset. Do you think there's momentum to change that and look at the TV space more holistically within agencies and brands, or do you think they're kind of still very stuck in that mindset?
I think the ambition is there. I think the ambition is to think about it in like not in so many silos. But I do think that the challenge is we just don't have we're kind of caught in having these silos because we don't have a common way to measure. We can't talk about it. So I think that's challenging. And it's hard because I know we talk like every event I go to, we talk about collaboration and we talk about bringing the industry together. And that's hard because we've got players there. Everyone has their different approach. Everyone's got a different agenda, motivation. But I think if we can't agree on that base level, we might risk just being this like small new testing thing. So if we really want to kind of see like really significant investments increase within the CTV space, we just have to come together and align on that and have some sort of common way of talking about things, a standardization in how we measure that allows everyone to kind of measure their inventory and put their best foot first as well. Yeah.
Great question. Who do you think is, or what organization is best suited to kind of help to develop that? Or you think it's more of a consortium approach? I know in the U.S. we have the IAB, or the IAB Europe as well. Is it something like a industry association, or is it a group of? How do you see that?
I think it's always going to be led by the buy side because that's
Led
who
by the buy
controls the
side,
purse
okay.
strings. But I will say that within the CTV world, the broadcasters, the traditional TV broadcasters cop a lot of flack. But one thing that that they've done so well, and you look at it across Europe, is despite being competitors, each individual broadcasters, they come together, they create a joint industry committee, and they align on measurement. And I think that there's actually things we can learn from broadcasters around the ability to say, hey, for us, we need to be united because that's best for the buyers, and ultimately that's best for our channel. But ultimately, then let your own content and brand speak for itself. So I think that there needs to be that level of collaboration within the CTV industry that we haven't yet seen.
All right. Well, a good challenge for you lovely people on this panel. That's it for me. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and
Thank you.
maybe we'll come back next year and see how this year's gone. So thank you very much.